Thank you everyone for being here this morning. Welcome to the policy session for the summit. My name is Sue Anderson and I'm on the board of People and Pollinators Action Network, PPAN. I'm your moderator for this session. I'll talk briefly about PPAN in a moment, and we're going to hear from three panelists today and then take some time to engage in some Q&A. So just so everybody knows what the format is. And we'll be using the chat features for that Q&A. And then we're going to follow that with some time for breakout rooms with 10 people in each breakout room so that people can have more in-depth discussions. And there will be a volunteer in each of those sessions to help take some notes and help guide the discussion. We're hoping that our technology all works okay and we can manage in this new virtual environment. It seemed to work pretty well for the keynote. But we do ask for your patience and for your good humor in doing this new virtual format. Before we get started, we would like to ask a few polling questions, assuming that the technology background is working here, about who's here and what your primary interests are in attending this session. Do we have those polling questions queued up? So the first question is, where are you joining us from? Now, I know we asked that in the big session, but we sort of want to get a sense of that from for people in the policy session, because policy is tends to be a little bit more locally based. So, you know, if you're coming from another state, it might be really interesting to hear about policy things you've got going on in your state. If you're coming from a particular municipality where you think some good policy stuff has happened, it would be good to know about that too. All of our panelists today, of course, are from state agencies, but policy happens at lots of different levels. So it looks like Denver, of course. Brighton is very big. Fort Collins. Okay, looks like mostly Front Range, and then we've got Utah in there too. Cool. We like Utah. Okay, you want to queue up the next question?
Sure.
The next question is, I have it here somewhere. Where do you work or volunteer? So what's your primary interest? What's your primary work? Are you in A through J, education, government, NGOs, private industry? Gardening. I'm going to assume that that's hobby gardening as opposed to professional gardening, maybe. Looks like we've got home gardeners. It looks like we've got government employees, scientists, community-based organizations. It's fun to watch these little bars move around. All right, still government is the largest, it's the largest bar, followed by gardening, which I'm not sure what we meant by that, but I'm going to assume that that's sort of home gardeners and people who are coming at this more from how they manage their own backyards. And science and community organizations. Okay, good. And then the third question is we've got the breakout rooms after the presenters. And so we want to get a sense of what people are most interested in terms of talking in more in-depth conversations. So state level pollinator policies, local grassroots and neighborhood advocacy, large scale land management. What's the most compelling? What's the most interesting here? Okay. Looks like we've got most of people weighing in here. So it looks like the largest one is large scale habitat and weed management. Certainly a big issue. State level policies, grassroots and neighborhood advocacy, and then local level. Those seem to be the most important categories. Okay, great. I think we've got enough information. So in some cases, we may end up doing 2 breakout rooms on the same topic if there's more people than want to participate in a group, because we can only take 10 in each breakout room. Okay, so Thank you for handling the polling on the back end there, Adrian and Joyce. Um, so before we get started in introducing the panelists, what I would like to do is talk a little bit about what PPAN has been doing in terms of policy. We've been around since 2014. We've worked at the state legislature with state agencies, local governments, and with other landowners, right down to our own backyards, to try and navigate the competing needs and interests with the critical need to protect pollinator and human health. So that's a tricky balance, walking that line and threading that needle. From our perspective, not too dissimilar to what Dave Goulston said, there are three main key issues that are threatening pollinators from our view. A changing climate in terms of, we both have extreme weather events, and you think about the fires that we've just had and what, floods, those kinds of things. Those definitely affect habitat and affect pollinators. Long-term temperature changes that affect the range of various species also is an issue. It affects the range of potentially food species like flowers, but also the species that dine on those flowers. Habitat destruction. So as lands are developed or turned into buildings, pavement, or monocultures of grass, food deserts, there's less habitat. The same is true, not many lands are being turned into agriculture these days, but the same thing is true as Dave Goulston said about as agricultural lands are being divided up and made into big fields of monoculture, that also is habitat destruction. There's just not enough food for many of the pollinators. And then third, the broad category of chemical toxins. Again, Dave talked about that. Mostly in the form of insecticides, herbicides, fertilizers, fungicides, and other chemicals that are applied to landscapes, either singly or as chemical cocktails, or as seed coatings. All of those things are important toxins that are affecting pollinator health. There's lots of opinions about how severe the impacts of any of these three are, but there's lots of data to indicate that they are indeed problems. So today we wanted to focus on some of our state level responses with representatives from the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Agriculture. So just to highlight a few of the things that PPAN has done at the state level, if you recall, we asked the legislature to designate I-76 from Nebraska to Denver as the state's first pollinator highway. And then we've worked with CDOT to develop best management practices. We've testified in a number of bills, including the sunset review of the Pesticide Applicators Act in 2015. We've worked with the Department of Natural Resources to ask them to develop a pollinator protection policy within the agency. When we first went to DNR, Mindy, I think you were in those meetings, we said, whose job is it to protect pollinators? And honestly, we got sort of some head scratching, and ultimately they said, well, we guess it's ours. And we were really talking about native pollinators more than the introduced honeybee, but still it wasn't clear, if DNR manages wildlife writ large, then it seems like it's DNR's responsibility to also protect pollinators writ large. So they did develop that pollinator protection policy, which was announced a couple of years ago at the Pollinator Summit. We've worked with the governor's office to designate June as Pollinator Month. And currently we're working on a pollinator license plate. So if you haven't signed the petition yet, you can go to our website and see that petition. It's so if you don't live in Colorado, ignore that, because it's intended to be signed by people who actually own a vehicle in Colorado. So it's a license plate program. So those are some of the things we've done at the state level. But building relationships with state agencies is part of what we've been working on. We've also worked at the local level. We've worked with local municipalities and counties to develop pollinator resolutions to help guide their staff in how to manage their lands. We've worked on transition to organic turf projects to try and get people to get agencies to manage their own lands differently. And we've, of course, worked at the local level with our Pollinator Pledge program, a lot of educational efforts to try and get people to manage their own backyards in pollinator-friendly ways. So thinking about that, keep in mind that policy can range from something that's mandated by elected officials or in the form of legislation and ordinances or ballot box decisions by voters. Certainly is interesting to be talking about policy today in light of sitting on pins and needles about what's going to happen from the recent election that we just had. But policy can also be internal policies at a departmental level that are brought about by leadership decisions or public input, or simply policies about how work should be conducted within a work group, maybe at a personal level, maybe at that work team level. And it might be in your own backyard. You might have your own personal policy about whether you only plant native plants or whether you apply any pesticides or not. And those kinds of decisions about how we design landscaping, what to plant, whether or not to apply chemicals, or whether it's a large landscape decision by land managers or farmers, all of those decisions have an impact on pollinator health. So today's session is really about policy. It's not specifically about what kinds of species or anything like that. We've got other sessions that may go into those kinds of questions, but this is about, what kinds of decisions can we make to protect pollinator health?